Today in class, we discussed whether or not people have free will, which is a bit of a deceptive question in some sense, and I'm willing to acknowledge that. We'll go into further detail on the nature of free will Friday, which I think can thoroughly answer a lot of the questions that we brought up during class. So I'll probably post another video on this topic come then. But for now, I figured it would be helpful to summarize what we discussed in class in order to build up the question of, do we have free will? On the one hand, I talked about empirical data, which suggests that if a certain amount of people reside in a certain space, a general understanding of populations that are similar to this mysterious group, this group in question, will demonstrate certain trends that have a surprising amount of accuracy. So the example that we used in class was you might be able to determine, and indeed you can determine things like this, which would say that if there's 10,000 residents in a city in Georgia, how many thefts will there be given data of citizens in similar areas? Now, this will be surprisingly accurate unless you start changing the geographical region much beyond that of similar regions, right? So if rather than Georgia, I'm suddenly looking at, South Africa or Norway or, places in Eastern Asia, that's going to be the biggest indicator of the percentage changes of how many people will actually, of that 10,000 group sample, will actually engage in things like theft. Now, this is somewhat alarming if you want to say that we have absolute free will. Because if you define free will simply as the ability to make a choice, it seems odd that given a similar sample size all throughout various different geographical regions, that you would have both a dependable outcome where you could say that, hey, if I test this in Georgia versus, even like Tennessee, something that's going to be close enough geographically and culturally, that I can actually determine how many people will engage in this crime. But I can also, so not only can you do that, which seems to imply that there just will be a certain amount of people who engage in theft or whatever have you. But I can also change those numbers by, again, just moving it to a different part of the world. I see this as an interesting reason to suggest that something like free will is at very least complicated. Well, why is that? Because if, again, I was to examine every single one of those 10,000 persons, some of them, it seems like, have to commit those crimes. Or at least that's what the statistics seem to suggest. And yet, there seems to be a problem if we want to say that they don't have any free will in the matter. So how do we work out this kind of a knot of a puzzle? Now, I will be very clear. I do think that the Christian religion teaches about the existence of things like the thing which we know as free will. Though I want to caveat what that means. I think sometimes we have in our minds free will is just simply the option to choose, Coke or Pepsi, and both options to be equally suitable in a given moment. I don't think that's exactly what free will is, and that's the question that we'll end up engaging on Friday. But for the debate that we're going to deal with, the quote, the bet on Wednesday, I want you thinking through whether or not we have free will. Here's one argument for why we would want to say that we do have something like free will. Okay, God is good, and God is omnipotent. He's also omniscient. That means that he can do anything, that he is ultimately good, and that he knows the effects of whatever he does. And so you would think that if these are all true, and we want to affirm that they're all true, then we would not have a world in which any lacking good can be perceptible, right? Because God knows what he needs to do in order to bring the good about, and he has the ability to do that. And yet we do see things with our eyes which perceptibly seem like they are grave evils. Not only sin, but just like you have things like tsunamis. Do you really want to say that that's fully a net positive? Well, you can say that's effective of sin and the fall and stuff like that, but that's going to get into the thing that I'm about to bring up, which is just that one way out of this this difficult kind of web of predications that we're going to make of God, and yet without wanting to predicate the creation of evil to him, is simply to recognize that it is also a good that God gives us a choice, at very least pre-fall and maybe even post-fall, a choice to do evil or to engage in sin. And that choice, in order for it to actually exist, it has to be the case that we could truly engage in evil or sin or something like that. So that way God doesn't just stand back and say, I'm going to, in theory, give you a choice, but I'm going to manipulate it such that it could never be the case that you don't actually engage in this grave evil. And there might be a number of reasons to say that that's actually a better world, where he allows for the possibility of evil, even though he doesn't directly cause evil. And now immediately we're starting to have a gradation of causes. Again, we've talked a lot about God as the principal cause. God is the agent that enacts something. We've also talked about God using things as instrumental causes, where he's not causing it directly in and of himself, but he's using something else to cause something, right? God is the instrumental cause, maybe of my being, but principally this is my parents, and so that doesn't mean that God's not a cause, but it does mean there's a difference between those two things. And then we also want to recognize that there's a difference between that and permissive causes. Well, what is a permissive cause exactly? The best example would probably be that of a judge, right? A judge may permissively allow you to experience the full weight of the law and take the consequences of your actions, while also willing and wanting what is best for you, and knowing that what is best for you is probably not to be incarcerated, right? So the judge can actively will that you have a full and free life, that you are not arrested. And yet, if you commit a crime, the judge can permissively will that you do experience the repercussions of your actions. And I think when you bring that into the discussion, you at least have a reason for why God would want to allow evil. Well, if this reason is valid, it seems then that we have to have something like a free will, right? Because otherwise, God would just be responsible, and indeed he would be the principal cause of grave evils. And we don't want to say that. So this is an interesting argument. It really only works for theists, but I think that you can argue for theism rationally, and you can make very legitimate defenses of the existence of God. We're not yet talking about an argument for free will from a Christian perspective, and that'll be an interesting conversation to bring into this as well. We opened up Scripture, and we saw things like Romans 9, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. Okay, so it seems like we're going to have a lot of challenges when it comes to God's bestowal of grace on individuals, and how that ends up giving us leeway to talk about how much will God allows us to engage in, if that's even a fair way of talking about this, or if we want to simply just say that God gives us over to our wills, which is a very C.S. Lewis way of talking about it. There's a bunch of different threads that you could follow with this conversation. We're going to follow it with Augustine quite a bit because he's going to bring this up. But I will say at this point at least, you need to keep an eye on not only whether or not humans have free wills as humans, but an important Christian question is going to be asked, are our free wills still functioning freely? Or are they functioning without some sort of secondary cause that's prohibiting them from being able to function as we would expect them to? Because keep in mind, again, Aquinas is going to define a free will, and I think rightly, as a will that doesn't have any cause inflicting on it its choice beyond that of the agent freely acting. And certainly we have sin in our lives, on our hearts. We're tainted with sin, as Augustine points out in Book 1 of the Confessions. And so we need to rid ourselves of that taint of sin. Without getting rid of that taint of sin, do we have anything like free will, or is it no longer really able to operate without that constant concupiscence on our lives? There are a lot of questions here. And again, this is a different video because I'm not arguing for a distinct thesis at this point, but I'm pointing to a lot of ways that the questions can go. That means that our quote the bet on Wednesday will have a lot of different possible directions to move. I will make a more or less succinct argument for the fact that God has a free will, right? That's going to be an important question. I don't think that means that God can sin, interestingly enough. But that's going to be a whole other issue that we have to deal with. And then ultimately, whether or not we have free wills. If it's not abundantly clear, we need to define more precisely what the will is and what it entails and what it doesn't entail. And there may be some surprises that we find out along the way there. In the meantime, have fun thinking through your arguments for and against the nature of for and against whether or not humans have free will. Your arguments can be both about Christians after the fall and before the fall, right? So you can argue that human nature has free will via its creation, but that we don't have free will anymore because we've forfeited that. That's totally fine and valid if you want to argue that. And certainly some Christians will want to argue exactly that. You can also argue that humans do have free will after the fall. Maybe you want to say that it's slightly tainted, but it's not completely tainted. Okay, that's fine and valid as well, too. And then you might want to argue that humans don't have free will at all because we always have some sort of principal cause that is going to be infecting or affecting our will to some degree or another. Whew, we got a lot of different things to talk about here. So I hope you enjoy thinking about that. Kind of let yourself go down the rabbit hole here, because that's exactly what you should be doing with this conversation. This is a fun one to stay up late at night with your friends talking about whether or not something like free will exists. There are good arguments for and against it. Again, if you're a Christian or if you're a theist in general, I think you see good reasons for it. If you're an atheist, almost all atheists will undeniably argue, and it seems like they have to if they're materialists, if they're strict materialists, they must argue that no such thing as free will exists. This is very interesting. All right, I will see you all come Wednesday for this topic. We'll meet for medieval tomorrow.